Hello, welcome to another edition of Hindsight. I'm David Hines, and today I want to talk about political leadership, and I want to do so within the context of Guyana. Of course, we are in the midst of what is turning out to be a very long election campaign, unusually long. 4 months is a long time for an election campaign. But already we are talking about leadership, in particular within the context of the proposed all opposition coalition between the APNU and the AFC. The question of leadership has arisen, and I want to talk a little bit about leadership. But I want to talk in particular about David Granger, the leader of the APNU, and of course the PNC. And I was inspired to do this commentary after reading a column by my good friend, Freddie Kissoon, who dealt with David Granger within the context of the All Opposition Coalition. Now, one doesn't have to agree with Freddie's conclusion. He concluded that Moses Nagamoto would be the better or more strategic leader for the All Opposition Alliance. But I was more interested in Freddie's analysis of David Granger as a leader within the context of African Guyanese and Guyanese in general. And I want to take off from that. I want to say that in our post-independence experience in the English-speaking Caribbean, we had become accustomed to what we call the charismatic leader. The leader who electrifies the populace, the leader who has a kind of godlike relationship with the followers, a leader who is expected to deliver the people. And so we have been accustomed to that kind of leader, the Burnhams, the Jagans, the Manleys, the Eric Williams, the Verbirds, the Eric Gary, etc., Errol Barrow. So that was one type of charismatic leader, the charismatic leader that led the people to independence and took over the reins of government. There was a second type of charismatic leader, and this was the radical, militant charismatic leader. In effect, the leader that challenged the more moderate kind of charismatic leaders, the leaders who were governing. Here were other leaders who were challenging them on the question of nationalism, on the question of the political economy, on the question of the content of independence. And it is that kind of leadership that gave us a Walter Rodney, a Tim Hector, a Geddes Granger, McCandle Dagger in Trinidad and Tobago, a Maurice Bishop in Grenada, a George Odlum in St. Lucia. These were charismatic leaders, but they were militant charismatic leaders. And so we in the English-speaking Caribbean had become accustomed to that kind of charismatic leader. And although time has moved on, and I am positing here that the era of the charismatic leader is over, and it has been over for the last 2 or 3 decades, that the society has changed, the needs of the society have become different, and so therefore the kind of leadership that is expected is different. With the passing of the charismatic leader, and I want to say the charismatic leaders were exceptional, but also they benefited from the fact that the population did not question them a lot. They were supposed to be the know-all and the be-all. And so, therefore, they were not questioned a lot. But as we moved into the new era, as our independence matured and we began to produce new generations of citizens, those citizens began to make different demands on our leaders. And so, therefore, the charismatic leader had passed into history. And we gave rise to a new kind of what we may call a kind of transactional leader, where there is a kind of transaction between leader and the population. More and more the population is making decisions based on what they think a particular leader at a particular junction can do, a kind of transitory thing. Not only as the charismatic leader gone, but what has gone is the political party that the charismatic leader led. When the charismatic leader was in office and was around, the charismatic leader called the shots. He decided everything in the party. He, and most cases it was he, there were some she's there, but generally they were men, and they called the shots. They determined who became what and who was not in the party and who goes and who went and all of that. And they were all powerful. And the party towed the line behind the leader, the comrade leader, the brother leader. And now, with the passing of the charismatic leader, what we are seeing and what we have seen is the kind of factionalization that was always there in the political parties coming to the fore. So we have political parties now that are mere factions, that people are challenging leaders in ways that they did not do before. We see in the PNC in Guyana that once Burnham passed and Hoyt came in, there was a challenging of Hoyt first by Hamilton Green later, then by the present Speaker Raphael Trotman at one time challenged Hoyt, and then when Hoyt went, we saw challenges to Corbyn and so on. So with the passing of the charismatic leader, the all-powerful leader, the godlike leader, we've seen a different kind of political party. The mass parties have now become, if you will, factions. Now, I'm saying all of that to set the stage to talk about David Granger. That David Granger, unlike all leaders, and let me say this before I go on to Granger, that our analysis and assessment of political leaders cannot be done outside of their era, outside of the time in which they are leading their parties and leading their countries. That is, we have to analyze political leadership within the context of the political times. And sometimes we make that arrogant mistake, and I say an arrogant because sometimes it's arrogant, sometimes it's based on ignorance, but we make the mistake of analyzing leaders outside of their historical and political context. So we hear a lot of comparisons between contemporary leaders and the leaders of the past. So Burnham would have never done that, or Jagan would have never done that. Well, Burnham and Jagan were leaders at a different era. We are now in the post-Cold War era. We are now 50 years on in terms of our independence. We are much more mature than we were at the time that Burnham and Jagan and the others were around. So I think we make a really serious mistake, and we miss a lot of serious discussions when we start from that premise of analyzing leaders outside of their historical and political context. Now to David Granger. David Granger burst onto the political scene just before the 2012 election as leader first of the PNC and then leader later on of the APNU. And by extension, therefore, he became leader of African Guyanese. And for you people who don't like me to talk about race, I will talk about race because race is real and it's ever-present and omnipotent, Guyanese situation. So Granger came onto the scene just before the 2012 election. And he was not a charismatic leader. He's not a charismatic leader. He could not be a charismatic leader because he's coming onto the scene in an era that is post-charismatic. And so to expect him to be this charismatic leader is really to expect the near impossible. That charisma has to do with not just the leader's posture and the leader's demeanor. Charisma is a relationship between leader and followers, where the followers see the leader as this godlike person. And so that relationship, he can do no wrong. He has all the answers. Granger comes into leadership when that era had passed. And let me say, there are a couple of factors that one has to take into consideration with David Granger, because I'm arguing here that in 2012, for that brief moment, African Guyanese ascribed to Granger a kind of charisma. That is, they developed around the 2012 election a charismatic relationship with Granger. Now here are the factors. One, that Granger came on, and he, first and foremost, was a military man. And in the context of 20 years of domination by the other by the government of the other ethnic group. Now, it is understandable that African Guyanese would look for a framework in which there can be some kind of defense. And so the military man becomes this man, this person who's going to ensure that advantage is not taken on us anymore. And so that was a very big appeal of Granger to African Guyanese. The second thing is that he was a historian. He was a historian who studied the African experience in Guyana and beyond. And that played an important role. Here was someone who knows something about us, who knows something about our history, who knows something about our identity and our condition. And that is important because I would argue that in terms of PNC leadership, no other leader, save perhaps Burnham, really had a kind of intellectual understanding of the African Guyanese condition. Granger is superlative in that sense. And so that was not lost on African Guyanese. That here was a person who is steeped in the understanding of our history. And then, the third factor is that this was a decent man. That in our politics in the Caribbean and in Guyana, we've been accustomed to leaders, including the charismatic leaders, who have not been quote-unquote decent, whose names have been muddied by scandals and so forth. But here was a man who was coming into the leadership who was seen as a decent man. And so the combination of the decent man, the man who understands our history, our identity, our condition, and the man who's a military man, made Granger the ideal kind of leader for African Guyanese at that particular time. And so at and around the 2012 election, African Guyanese developed this kind of charismatic relationship with Mr. Granger. And that is what really pushed that campaign with the AFC. The second thing that was important about Granger is that for the first time, you had a leader from the PNC who was doing something that was remarkable, and that he was he made the party part of a larger coalition. And the PNC had talked about power sharing before, but never had it concretely become part and parcel of a larger coalition. And here is it, Granger was doing this. Now, although Granger was not the architect of the APNU, the architect of the APNU on the PNC side was Robert Corbin, and he doesn't get enough credit for that. But Granger was seen as the leader of this coalition, something that the PNC leaders did not do before. And the importance of that coalition, as the residents of West Bobby's told myself and Dr. Rup Narayan when we went up there to campaign, they said, brothers, look, for the first time, we don't have to choose between Burnham people and Guyana people. We don't have to choose between Burnham people and Rodney people. Now, that was a tremendous statement about the APNU, because you see, the giants in the African Guyanese community were Burnham, Guyana, and Rodney. They were the political giants. And here is what the APNU was doing, bringing together those forces, and so in a sense removing that burden that African Guyanese have had to carry for the last 3-4 decades in Guyana. And Granger is leading this. So Granger becomes the anointed leader. He becomes the charismatic leader. And that is what really pushed that campaign. Now, once the elections were over, Granger had to deal with the challenges of leadership. He had to deal with the factions within the PNC and those outside of the PNC, because there are factions in the party and there are also PNC people who are outside of the party. So he had to negotiate those challenges within the party. He had to negotiate the challenges within the APNU coalition. And of course, he had to deal with a very rampant government. And so therefore, any leader put in that position would find it a very difficult task to do that. And so Granger opted for the kind of gradualism that he thought was best suited to the circumstances. But here is where the problem is. The problem is that after 20-odd years of PPP rule, there are two tendencies that have developed in the black community. And one tendency is an accommodationist tendency, where some African Guyanese have decided that there's no way we can win these people, we can win the PPP, and let us join them. And so we've seen that tendency. It may be a minority tendency, but I think the other important tendency is the radicalized tendency. What the PPP has done through its uncaring and domineering kind of rule is that it has radicalized a large section of the African Guyanese community. And it is that radicalized section that really empowered Granger. And so the election came and gone, and that radicalized section is looking to Granger to up the ante, looking to Granger to govern in a radicalized way. And Granger, in the face of these challenges, but also his own political outlook, his own outlook that was developed when he was a soldier, the need for discipline, order, and so forth. He comes out of that tradition. So here it was that a radicalized section of the community really made him into this charismatic leader, but he was not able to deliver on that kind of radicalism that pushed him into the leadership and pushed him into the spotlight. So what we have had over the last 3 years is an uneasy relationship between David Granger and the constituency, his constituency which has become radicalized. And a lot of the criticisms of Granger arises out of that disconnect, if you will. My own criticism of Granger, which I've never done before, those of you who have been following me know that I've criticized the APNU. And when I criticize the APNU, I'm criticizing the PNC, I'm criticizing the WPA, I'm criticizing the others, and I'm criticizing all those leaders around Granger. Because I do believe in the absence of charisma, Granger's leader cannot be fully responsible for the mistakes or the perceived mistakes that the APNU made. No, he will have to take responsibility because he is the leader. But if I may make a mild criticism of David Granger, I think it has been his inability to reach out and to acknowledge that radicalism and try to speak to that radicalism. I don't think he's done a good job of doing that. Now, I've seen David Granger, I've heard David Granger in Buxton, and whenever he has spoken in Buxton, he has always done that. He has always responded to that radicalism without saying radicalism. He has responded to it, and one got the sense when he speaks in Buxton that although he's not on the same radical page with the rest of us, at least he's acknowledging our presence and acknowledging that we are making sense. He has not been able to do that at a national level, and I think that is my mild criticism of him. Now, where does this leave us? Some people are arguing that David Granger, because of his failure to respond to that radicalism or give leadership to that radicalism in the black community, is not fit to be the presidential candidate for the APNU. And some are arguing he's not fit to be the presidential candidate for the joint opposition. And I think one has to debate that, but I would caution that in analyzing David Granger, that you cannot analyze him in the context of expediency. I think once we begin to push an Indo-Guyanese leader, what will happen is that fractured relationship between the African Guyanese community and David Granger would be healed, because it will force, and this is how ethnicity works, in the face of an imposition. And a lot of African Guyanese, I'm speaking here, representing the sentiments I've been hearing, that a lot of African Guyanese sees this proposed alliance as an imposition of leadership on them. And one has to be clear about that. And I think as they respond to that, they will close ranks with David Granger. And he would become once again the kind of leader that they are looking for. This is how politics work. This is how ethnicity works. And we have to take cognizance of that. My own view is that the question of leadership in an ethnic society is a very important question and should not be taken lightly. So as we move forward, I'm saying that one must analyze David Granger within the context of the last 5 years or so, and not in the context of something else. We also have to be able to separate our own personal, those of us who are analysts, those of us who are commentators, those of us who aspire to be leaders, have to be able to separate our own personal sentiments from a larger analysis of what is happening in the country. And so, as we go forward, I want us to pay close attention to this whole question of leadership and how leadership is perceived. In ethnic societies, as most societies around the world are ethnic societies, the whole question of a leader looking like us is important, and we must not make that an unimportant thing. So those of us who are saying, well, Granger is not fit to be leader because he has not been militant enough, or he has not been a thing, look at what he has done in Linden, etc., etc. We have to look at those things in their broad manifestations and not in our expedient need today to what we call remove the PPP from office, and so anything goes. I think there is still a place for sober analysis. There is still a place for sober discussion, and there is still a place for common sense conclusion. Until the next time, this is David Hinds, thanking you for tuning in to yet another edition of Hinds'Sight. And remember, you can catch my other commentaries on my YouTube channel, Hinds'Sight, David Hinds, Guyana-Caribbean Politics. That's Hinds'Sight, David Hinds, Guyana-Caribbean Politics. Or you can follow me on my website, Guyana-Caribbean Politics.com. See you next time.